There has not been a universally accepted definition of development. So, how do we know we're developing? Finland was recorded to be the happiest country 3 times in a row. How can an entire country be happy? These are some of the questions we'll be discussing on today's episode of Future Possibilities. Roll that intro.
I'm walking with you. We're in this complicated thing we call life.
Welcome again to Future Possibilities. Today's episode is the basics, development and happiness. And you might wonder, why development, why happiness? So firstly, why is it relevant to talk about development or happiness as the concept themselves? Let me give you a story. So there was this man who died and he went to heaven. And in heaven, right, he was walking the golden streets and admiring the pearly gates. He saw someone he recognized. And he was like, "Hey Leandro, you're in heaven, how?" And she said, "Oh, I stopped being a politician at last minute. Save me, eh?" He's like, "Yep, makes sense." And so then she turns to him, right, and asks him, "How was your experience on earth?" And he goes like, "Well, I lived a very fulfilled life, eh?" And she turns and says, "Okay, so exactly what did you do?" And then he goes like, "Well, mostly just depressed." And so like you see that ending, that's not something that you'd expect from, "Oh, I lived a fulfilled life, I was depressed most of the time," right? A fulfilled life is not as, you don't picture fulfilled life as a sad life, constantly complaining and all these things. A fulfilled life is something that you feel happy, you did great things, you left a good legacy and you lived a good life. That's what you'd think a fulfilled life would be. So why that story? It's because we're only here on earth once, right? You only have life once on earth. You only have life once on earth. You're only going through this once. So if that's the case, if you can only do this once, why go through this having struggled, having been sad, lonely, and all these things? Like, why go through your only opportunity of being through earth like this in such a terrible way? If there's an alternative, why should we go through life surviving if we have the capacity to thrive, right? Like, just think about it. We're called underdeveloped countries, we are struggling, we have all these issues, but we actually do have the capacity to thrive. That's the relevance of why we should actually consider this concept of development and happiness as a society and as an individual. So let's start with development. Like it was stated earlier, there is no universally accepted definition of development, right? So that means countless scholars have studied the concept of development, studied the concept in its depth, and they can't agree on an accepted definition. However, there have been popular definitions that have existed throughout history. So we'll start from a certain author. His name is Gilbert Rist. He wrote a book, The History of Development, from Western Origin to Global Faith, right? So in his book, right, contrary to popular belief that the word development has just existed, no, it means improvement. It means develop, like it means making the society better, right? His take was actually slightly on the different side, right? So he argued that the term development, right, or what is known now when we talk about all the nations' development, national development goals, actually started from the 1950s. Before the 1950s, right? So 1950s, that's a period of World War I, the period of time when the UN was being formed, World Bank, and all these international organizations. And he said before that time, he said development was actually looked at as an intransitive phenomenon, meaning it just occurred. It's not something that you strive for. It's not something that like villages come together and say let's develop or anything like that. It just it's something that was looked at as it just occurred, right? People are developing here and there. However, in the 1950s, that shifted the way people looked at development, right? So 1950s, World War II is done. They're trying to unite the world. These are the allies and the various major parties who are part of the UN. They're trying to unite the world. And so one of the major influences, right, that came on the concept of development came from Harry Truman's speech right? So this was the president of America at that time. And so his 4-point speech, right, particularly the fourth point. So in his speech he said, fourth, we must embark on a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas. More than half of the people in the world are living in conditions approaching misery. Their food is inadequate. They are victims of disease. Their economic life is primitive and stagnant. Their poverty is a handicap and a threat both to them and to more prosperous areas. For the first time in history, humanity possesses the knowledge and the skill to relieve the suffering of these people. So the term in particular that we should pay attention in his speech was underdeveloped areas, right? So before that, the world was not looked at as that, like developed areas and underdeveloped areas. That's not how the world was looked at as, right? It was just areas and their names. During the World War II, it was allies, and like the Soviet Union and all these, but not developed and underdeveloped countries. And how that term came in was actually politics, American politics, and how they wanted to improve their international policy and the way things are looked at in the country, because that's what they're looking at. How do we unite the world? And that's how that entire process happened, and the word underdeveloped areas was introduced. So during that time, the World Bank had been in place, and they had defined poor countries as countries with a per capita income of $100. Now, per capita income is basically a measure of the average income of an individual, right, in a nation. So if we do all the calculations, how much is one person in Zambia making? That's the per capita income on average. How much is one person in Zambia making? That's the per capita income. And so they had labeled poor countries as countries with a per capita income of $100, right? And so Truman delivered the underdeveloped and put a global mission to relieve misery and relief and poverty and all these things, right? And reduce diseases and all these things. And so that's his global mission, and you're having these international organizations measuring countries based on that. So what's the solution? If a poor country is a country with a per capita income of $100, right? Meaning that if we increase the $100, then the development of that area, they'll stop being underdeveloped countries, they'll stop being poor countries, because then those terms became synonymous, poor, underdeveloped. So the solution: increase individual countries in economic growth, right? And they will be developed, right? And to be honest, that's how some of us feel, right? If you increase our incomes, then we'll be developed as individuals. You improve the economy, then you'll be developed as Zambia, right? If the economy was really good, like either going 1-1 with the dollar, or the dollar is like at 1 and we're like 0.5, best economy in the world, right? And that's how we think. And so the world went down that path, right? The world went down the path of, let's improve the economies of these poor countries, and we'll help them develop, we'll help them reduce their poverty, we'll help them reduce their suffering. And so we have scholars during that time with a popular view that economic growth was the solution to development or underdevelopment or improving poor countries. Arthur Lewis is one of those authors. So his belief was that, or his argument was that, if you improve the economy, or if there's a rapid growth in terms of the economic status of a country, all that will trickle down to the rest of the areas in society, right? So for example, the economy blooms, that means there'll be more money in people's pockets. That means more people will be able to send their children to school. More people will be able to feed themselves better. So all the problems that you would ever think of, right? All the problems that you'd ever think of in society, if you increase the economy, and put more money in people's pockets, they will be solved. Right? I've got more money, I can provide education, I have food, I have a roof over my head, I have clothes on my body. And that was his theory of economic growth, that if the economy grows large enough, right? So if there's a large economic growth, then we'll be able to develop as countries. And so you have these international organizations like the World Bank, the UN, and various other organizations then following down that path. To improve the world, we need to improve underdeveloped countries or poor countries. To do that, we need to improve their economy or provide them with very good economic growth. However, by the 1970s, what's usually termed as the Golden Age, right, there was an exponential economic growth in various countries, and most of them exceeded the targets that had been set by the organizations, right, the international organizations. They had grown so much, right, and it was impressive. That's why it's called the Golden Age. However, they discovered that the inequality levels were high, and certain countries, though the economy was great, were actually in worse places than when they started, right? And that's what they missed. The people who argue in economic growth, everything is okay, missed one important factor: inequality. Inequality, that is the distribution of income within the country. It was unequal. So you have maybe 10 billionaires and 2 million citizens. The income distribution can largely be just on those 10, right? So that's where they missed it. So a critic came up, a scholar came and argued that the use of income as an indicator of development should not be done. It should be discouraged, right? Because there are many other factors that affect a country's development, right? And not just economic growth. So even if the economy is great, it's possible for countries to be in worse off situations, like it had been shown, right? So this is not just his speculation. The Golden Age had shown that countries' economies had improved, but situations were not any better, right? So countries then started rethinking things, right, and saying, okay, you know what, let's maybe add poverty reduction, so increase your economy and also reduce poverty, right, because those are not actually synonymous, right? Increase your economy and reduce poverty as goals. However, Dudley Seers, great scholar, came and argued otherwise, saying that income, like I had said before, should not be used as an indicator of development. So in his famous work, he stated this: we can, after all, fall on the supposition that increases in national income, if they are faster than the population growth, sooner or later lead to the solution of social and political problems. But the experience of the past decade makes this belief look rather naive. Dudley Seers argued that the measure necessary, right, for development is that you have to find out the universal conditions that are necessary for an individual to realize their full potential, right? So here he's kind of shifted it, right? So if you look at the beginning, right, economic growth will solve the development poverty issues, right? What was the focus? The economy of the country. However, Dudley Seers says, oh look, your focus was development of the country, and look at where it ended up. The people were still in a worse state, even though economies had increased. So he said that the measure should not be the economic growth of the nation. However, the measure should be the conditions that are necessary for someone to realize the full potential. So what are those conditions? He called them basic needs, right? So you need food, you need shelter, you need clothing. He also argued you need a job, because some of those things are gotten by income, right? So you need a job to be able to obtain various goods that you need. He also stated that though employment and per capita income were related, the direct link between poverty and per capita income was income distribution. So his next point of what is necessary as a measure for development was inequality. You need to measure the inequality, right? Because how much a person gets, right? How much a person gets in terms of what's the per capita income is not just enough. And let me give you an example. So Mongo builds a factory in Mongo, builds a cotton factory, and is producing tons upon tons of cotton, and the company is booming, right? And the people who are employed in that company are also getting really high salaries, because it's a huge company, right? So you're looking at the lowest paid worker getting 10,000 kwacha. How exactly does that improve the situation in Kitwe? Right? How exactly does that improve the situation in Chinsali, right? How exactly does that actually improve those situations, right? So as a result, the economy is developing and becoming better because that company is thriving, right, and improving the amount of money that's in everyone in its employees' pockets. However, the income distribution is unequal. So you have Mongo, you have Northwestern Province because they're neighboring, and maybe there's even trade and entrepreneurship businesses coming up, improving in terms of its economic capacity. However, Northern Province still remains the same, right? So you have to measure the inequality within that nation to determine whether it's actually developing or not. And that's the thing with income distribution. It's usually the people at the top who get most of the income, while the people at the bottom remain the same or even become worse. The questions to ask about a country's development are therefore, what has been happening to poverty? What has been happening to unemployment? What has been happening to inequality? If all three of these have declined from high levels, then beyond doubt, this has been a period of development for the country considered. Dudley Seers' theory prevailed, right? And the UN actually shifted its goals from economic growth to inequality, unemployment, and poverty. These three show whether a country has developed. However, and that makes sense, right? And that makes sense. We look at it and say a country obviously would have developed if those three are dealt with. However, another scholar came and criticized Dudley Seers' approach, still calling it too narrow, right? Economic growth, too narrow, too many other factors. Dudley Seers' approach, too narrow, too many other factors, right? And that scholar was Amartya Sen. He was a scholar who came about in the 1990s, and he released the work Development as Freedom, right? So this is his argument, right? This is his argument about what development is. His argument was that development should be about increasing the possible freedoms of individuals. Your freedoms, basically. So this is like your freedom to wear whatever you want, to go wherever you want, to eat whatever you want, right? To enjoy whatever you want. Those freedoms, that is true development. Increasing your freedoms, right? Increasing your choices, right? The amount of choices that you make and the amount of choices that you can make, right? So like some would say, oh, I can't go to this school because it's this expensive. Development is about increasing your choices. If you want to go to that school, if the country is developing well, you should be able to choose that because you're able to, because it's development, right? So Amartya Sen's theory was that man, or people, right? People should be the center of development, right? And not the means of development. So this was the focus. We're going back again. The focus of development when Truman made his speech was economic growth. The focus of development after Dudley Seers' critique was unemployment, inequality, and poverty, right? However, Amartya says that shouldn't be the focus. That's the means to the goal, right? The focus should be the goal itself, which is man, increasing the freedoms of man. He further argued that development consists of far more than just the growth of the gross national product, industrialization, increase of personal incomes, social modernization, advancement in technology, reduction in poverty, reduction in unemployment, and reduction in inequality. It consists of far more than that. So, Amartya Sen's theory was then used by a man called, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but I'll just say it and put the name below, Mabab al-Haq. Mabab al-Haq. So he used the work of Amartya Sen to launch the first Human Development Report, and the work of Amartya Sen became the foundation of the new human development paradigm. And as you know, those two projects are under the UN. So you would think, wow, we have transitioned, right? We've transitioned from just looking at one aspect, we've looked at three aspects of development, right? And we should be right now like done on Amartya Sen's theory. It's great, right? It's not about whether the economy is doing great. It's not about whether inequality levels have dropped or unemployment have dropped, but it's about the individual citizens. do they have the choices that they would like to make? Because not everyone wants to buy a Lamborghini, right? Some people are just okay with a Toyota Hilux or Toyota Sprinter or something. Some people are just okay with that. Not everyone wants to live in a mansion. Some people are just okay living in small homes that are just designed well, nice interior designing, right? So the most important thing is development is not, oh, I'm living in a big house. Development is, I can make the choices that I want to make without restriction. So Amartya Sen's theory, expand the freedoms, the real freedoms of the individuals that they enjoy, so they can make the choices that they want to make, because that's development, right? Not everyone wants to, oh, I'm eating in a hotel. Some people just want to eat just at home and the normal food, and they're happy like that. And that's the goal of development. And so, like, after this explanation, we're like, wow, we're going through a lot. It should be over. We have our definition. Not at all. There's still one more definition that we'll look at. So after Amartya Sen, and he was actually one of the pioneers of this new definition, or this new way of looking at development, we look at sustainable development. So sustainable development, right? Sustainable development is basically following Amartya Sen's theory of development as freedoms, and stating that sustainable development is the development that meets the immediate needs of the society, however preserves the resources for the future too. Because you have development where they're like the way we see with the mines, right? We know the mines are not renewable resources, but we are constantly extracting the copper and extracting the minerals, not with a clear plan of how to preserve the minerals too for the future, right? And they're saying that's not sustainable development, because you're meeting the immediate needs of the present, right, with all your extraction of materials, and the giving of land, cutting down of forests, and endangering all these things. However, in the future population is also going to want to develop, right? But they won't be able to meet their needs, because you find that all the copper is done, the forests are damaged, and etc. etc. So sustainable development, yes, meets the immediate needs of the society, however, puts in place policies that protect the future, so that they are also able to meet their needs. And that actually, I like that theory of development better, right? Because at the end of the day, we know the saying, right? A man who plants trees in a forest, knowing that he won't sit under their shade, is a man who understands life, right? So the question is, then what is the definition being followed in your country of development, right? What exactly does development mean in your country? And how exactly do you see that being implemented? So those are some of the things that you then ask, and realize why the question of development is important for the nation to be able to answer. Because then it tells you where your development projects should be placed, where the most of the money from the taxpayers' money and whatever revenue that's been gotten should be placed, where it should be invested, right? You're building schools, that's great, because at the end of the day, you want people educated. Educated can develop themselves, increase their number of choices. So that's my take on the question of development. That's what I'm able to share on the question of development, right? Development as a freedom, while observing our future generations, and how what we're doing now can end up affecting them, and ensuring that we don't endanger them because of trying to meet our own needs.